My name is Christina Peake. I describe myself as a transdisciplinary artist, so I'm a PhD researcher with the University of Westminster National Archives. I'm looking at, say, the National Archives in terms of kind of documenting and mapping kind of ecological colonial histories within the Caribbean. And then my work then, or my practice, kind of engages then, well, how can we find kind of ecological interventions and cultural interventions through contemporary art? The marine environment heavily contextualises whatever histories I'm looking at, whatever research I'm bringing out, how we can use things like archives and collections to really kind of think about what is healthy and what is degraded. If we looked at the marine environment, you look at biodiversity indicators to see its health and degradation. And what if I take that same paradigm and apply it in a cultural context, and I look at a collection as if it's an ecosystem? It reminds me to really kind of sink into this stunning kind of marine imagery that I ended up creating, filming off the coast of Cornwall, and for my particular research focus, which was the Caribbean, specifically looking at Barbados, which is part of my heritage. Machine learning was a brilliant conduit for surfacing those things. How can that be a tool to be able to surface bias, and how does that feed in also, I think, to how an artist can then interrogate kind of collections and archives. The partners I was working with was the Wellcome collection, iniva, and the World Museums in Liverpool, so particularly the International Slavery Museum and the World Museum. If I'm thinking of these ideas of what is health and what is degradation, how do you actually grade that? What does bias actually look like? So defining like racial bias, for example, the process of using machine learning was incredibly self-reflective actually, because you had to really consider what is this question, in a kind of binary context of yes or no, and how do I grade that? Machine learning enabled me to think not only just incredibly deeply about what is bias, how does it surface, considering your own reflection of your own bias. Because I think as soon as you start learning about machine learning, you realise that bias is inherent within the content or the data sets that you're using. And then where I found degradation, I found opportunities for restorative and regenerative kind of practices. So for me, that comes out in speculative narrative and ideas of critical fabulation. One of these stories that's been arising is one where I call wayfinding shells. So this came from Wellcome collection. So I was looking particularly at 17th and 18th century texts. Within the travelogues, specifically Barbados at this time, there was a lot of kind of documentation of indigenous society. And this actually linked to another works I found actually at the World Museum, which was early indigenous shell implements, which I think was kind of Taino origin. The historical narrative that came out of the Wellcome collection and then linked with these shell implements that I found at the World Museum created this wayfinding shells. These are kind of ideas of wayfinding and navigation, and that links in also to ideas of divination. So this idea of kind of divining what is the path that, and in terms of freedom or just in terms of sanctuary that these societies may have had. Also highlighting the cosmology, say for example, indigenous Caribbean cosmologies that link to the marine environment. So this marine imaginary, this environment, to me, the best way that I can replicate that for you and divine it for you is to return back to the Caribbean and create this archipelago out of the works that I have and make it kind of as a divine and kind of ancestral and an intimate and sensual experience. This idea where the divination bowl was salvaged from the Graham Hall Sanctuary in Barbados, which is the last mangrove in Barbados, that now is particularly being kind of quite polluted and things. So this very unique ecosystem is in rapid kind of decline, but this is a place where you'd have coral assemblages on mango roots. So it's a place where the sea and the land converge. It's a place like a sacred space in terms of potentially indigenous practice, African descendant practice. So this idea that this divination bowl was created so that any other of the stories and the protagonists that you read, all this would be a central site by which they would have practiced and given offerings and divination to enable resistance or to remember escape or lots of different things. I think I responded to the project research questions, I think in kind of 3 strands. So one was looking at machine learning and how I can really use this tool to kind of surface and interrogate bias and even understand how that process and how that technology actually works. The second was surfacing, say, this idea of polyvocality or multivocality within my practice and the work that's being created. So you're not just surfacing the kind of these ancestral kind of stories, but new critical contemporary narratives of how they can be lived. And then I think the third was also, I think surfacing questions around, when we look at what is silenced, what is underrepresented, is bringing forward, I think, something that really, I think, in terms of the collections and the partners and what we were looking at, how that can really come into contemporary context today and make that difference.